December 1944. A frozen crossroads, somewhere in the Belgian Ardennes. The trees are coated in ice. The sky is the colour of old lead. Snow has been falling for 2 days and shows no sign of stopping. A German soldier is kneeling in the snow beside an American body. The American is face down. His helmet has rolled a few feet away. His rifle is gone, already taken by someone who passed before. The German soldier is not searching for intelligence. He is not looking for maps or code books or unit patches or anything that might matter to an officer in a warm headquarters 30 kilometers behind the line. He is pulling off the dead man's boots. The photograph that captured this moment, taken during the opening days of the German Ardennes offensive, would become one of the most quietly devastating images of the entire war. Not because of its violence. There is no blood visible. The scene is almost gentle. A man kneeling beside another man in the snow, working a boot free from a stiffening foot. What makes the photograph devastating is what it means. The German soldier is not doing this because he is cruel. He is doing it because his own boots have failed. The soles are cracked. The leather is splitting at the seams. The lining, what remains of it, is damp and rotting against his skin. He has been marching in footwear that a year earlier would not have been issued to a rear echelon clerk. And the American lying dead in the snow beside him is wearing boots that are, by every measure the German soldier can feel with his own frozen hands, better than anything his army can still provide. He does not understand how this is possible. He is a soldier of the Wehrmacht. His army conquered France in 6 weeks. His country's engineers designed the Tiger tank, the V-2 rocket, and the Messerschmitt 262 jet fighter. His nation's military tradition stretches back 3 centuries to the armies of Frederick the Great. And yet, kneeling in the snow on the morning of what his commanders have told him will be the great counteroffensive that turns the war around, he cannot get a pair of boots that will hold together for a month in the field. The American whose boots he is taking was a private, nobody important, probably a replacement, sent forward from a depot somewhere behind the lines. And this replacement, this ordinary draftee from a country the German officer corps had dismissed 2 years earlier as a nation of shopkeepers and factory hands, had been wearing boots that were built to last, backed by a system that would replace them when they wore out, and supplied by an industry so vast that it could put new leather on the feet of 8 million soldiers without breaking stride. The question the German soldier could not have articulated that morning, because he was too cold and too hungry and too focused on the immediate problem of his own freezing feet, is the question this entire investigation is built around. How did the nation that built the most feared military machine in the history of the world end up unable to put decent boots on its own soldiers? And how did the nation the Wehrmacht had mocked as the dollar army, a country of salesmen and assembly line workers, end up fielding a logistical system so deep, so relentless, and so staggeringly productive that its youngest, greenest, most anonymous private was better shod than a German veteran of 5 campaigns? That question, the question of boots, is not a small question. It is, when you follow it all the way down, one of the central questions of why Germany lost the war. But the answer does not start in the Ardennes. It does not even start in 1939. It starts with a piece of leather and a Prussian military tradition that was already centuries old when the first shots of the Second World War were fired. It starts with the jackboot. The German marschstiefel, the marching boot, was one of the most recognizable symbols of military power ever created. Soldiers called it the Nobelbecher, the dice cup, because of its tall, cylindrical shape. It was a pull-on boot, constructed entirely of leather, with a hobnailed sole, a steel-reinforced heel, and a shaft that rose anywhere from 35 to 39 centimeters up the calf. It weighed considerably more than any American service shoe. When a formation of Wehrmacht infantry marched in unison on cobblestones, the sound of those boots was a sound the occupied nations of Europe would not forget for generations. The jackboot was never merely footwear, it was doctrine made visible. The Prussian military tradition believed that uniformity was strength. Every soldier looked the same. Every soldier marched the same. Every soldier's boots hit the ground at the same moment. The jackboot was the physical expression of that philosophy. It communicated, without a word being spoken, that the man wearing it belonged to something larger than himself, something precise, something disciplined, something that moved as one body. The boot had practical advantages too. Its tall shaft protected the lower leg from brush, mud, and shallow water crossings. The hobnailed sole gave good purchase on soft ground and cobblestones alike. The pull-on design meant there were no laces to break or snag in undergrowth. For an infantry soldier marching 20 or 30 kilometers a day on European roads, the marschstiefel was a proven piece of equipment. It had worked for the Kaiser's army in the First World War. It had carried the Reichswehr through the interwar years, and when the Wehrmacht mobilized in the late 1930s, the jackboot was as much a part of a German soldier's identity as his helmet or his rifle. For a brief, spectacular period, the jackboot delivered on every one of its promises. When the Wehrmacht rolled into Poland on the 1st of September, 1939, the marching boot was at its peak. Thousands of pairs, well made from quality domestic leather by a network of German tanneries and cobblers, carried infantry across the Polish frontier in days. 8 months later, those same boots, on many of the same men, marched through the Arc de Triomphe in Paris after the fall of France in just 6 weeks. The hobnails rang on the Champs-Élysées. The newsreels captured it. The world watched, and the world was afraid. What the world did not see, and what the German High Command did not yet want to acknowledge, was that the jackboot was already doomed. Not because of a design flaw, not because a better boot existed somewhere, but because the boot consumed something Germany could not replace. It consumed leather, and leather, in a nation cut off from global trade by a British naval blockade, was about to become more precious than ammunition. The American army, meanwhile, was wearing something nobody wanted to photograph. In 1939, the standard United States military shoe was the Type 1 service shoe, a smooth russet leather Oxford with a leather sole and almost no ankle support. It was a parade ground shoe, designed for an army of roughly 190,000 men who spent most of their time on American bases, walking on flat ground between barracks and mess halls. It was, by the honest assessment of the quartermaster corps itself, inadequate for any kind of sustained combat operations. The Type 2 that followed was marginally better, but still fundamentally a garrison shoe pretending to be ready for war. When the United States entered the fight after Pearl Harbor, those shoes went to war, and they failed. In the deserts of North Africa, where sand ground through the stitching like sandpaper, the shoes came apart at the quarters. In the mountains of Tunisia, where rain turned trails into streams, leather soles lost all traction on wet rock. And most catastrophically, in the freezing mud of the Italian peninsula in the winter of 1943 to 1944, American footwear disintegrated under sustained combat conditions. Smooth leather soles dissolved in the bottomless mud of the Rapido and Volturno river valleys. Uppers split along the seams in freezing overnight temperatures. Water poured in through every stitch. Men who had been issued footwear designed for the parade grounds of Fort Benning, Georgia, were now standing for days at a time in foxholes filled with icy water in the Apennine Mountains, and their feet were paying the price. The result was a medical catastrophe that rarely appears in popular histories of the war, but which was measured in its effect on combat strength, as damaging as any German counterattack the Fifth Army faced that winter. Trench foot. The condition occurs when feet are exposed to cold, wet conditions for extended periods without relief. Blood vessels constrict, tissue begins to die. The foot swells, blisters, and in severe cases, turns gangrenous, requiring amputation. In the Italian campaign during that first winter of fighting, trench foot accounted for roughly 20% of all casualties. In the 5th United States Army, specifically, according to the official Army Medical Department history, the trench foot rate in the winter of 1943 to 1944 was approximately 10 times higher than that of British troops fighting in identical terrain under identical weather conditions on the same front line. The difference was not courage. It was not tactics. It was not training. The difference was boots and foot discipline. The British had better cold-weather footwear and stricter protocols for drying socks and rotating men out of wet positions. The Americans had shoes that were designed for Kansas and were paying for it with their own men's feet. That failure, the humiliation of watching your own soldiers crippled not by the enemy, but by their own equipment, while your allies in the next foxhole kept fighting, is the low point of the American story. German intelligence, reading reports on American trench foot rates in Italy, would have been justified in concluding that the Americans could build factories but could not build a functioning army. And about the boots specifically, they would have been right. They would have been catastrophically wrong about what happened next, because what happened next is the part of this story that separates the two armies, the two nations, and the two industrial civilizations that were fighting this war. The Americans looked at the disaster in Italy, and they fixed it. They did not fix it perfectly. They did not fix it instantly. But they fixed it with a speed, and at a scale that the German system, by 1943, was no longer capable of matching. And the fix did not start with a boot. It started with a man. The man at the center of the fix was a French-born professor from the Harvard Business School named Georges Frédéric Doriot. Born in Paris in 1899, Doriot had come to the United States to study at Harvard, joined the faculty, become one of the most respected teachers of industrial management in the country, and was naturalized as an American citizen in 1940. He was recruited into the quartermaster corps by Major General Edmund Gregory, the quartermaster general of the United States Army, who happened to have been one of Doriot's former students at Harvard. As a brigadier general and chief of the military planning division in the office of the quartermaster general, which directed research and development for the corps, Doriot brought something into the military procurement system that it had never had before. He brought scientists. He brought industrial engineers. He brought the rigorous, data-driven, problem-solving culture of American business management into the business of keeping soldiers alive. Doriot did not design boots himself. What he did was build the organizational structure that allowed the right people to identify the problem, engineer a solution, test it in the field, and then manufacture it in quantities that matched the scale of the war. Under Doriot's direction, the Quartermaster Corps developed the M1943 uniform system, a layered clothing concept designed specifically for the conditions of the European theatre. And within that system, the single most important item was the boot. The Type 3 service shoe, designated shoe, service, Type 3, was accepted under Boston Quartermaster Depot Specification 110 in June of 1943. It was built on a principle so simple it sounds almost embarrassing to describe in a story about the largest and most destructive war in human history. They turned the leather inside out. The standard smooth finish leather of the Type 1 and Type 2 shoes looked polished and military, but its surface shed waterproofing compounds. The flesh side of the cowhide, the rough, napped inner surface that normally faces inward, held waterproofing grease, which the soldiers called dubbing, far more effectively than smooth leather. So the Quartermaster Corps specified that the upper be constructed with the flesh side facing outward, creating what every soldier who wore it simply called the roughout boot. It used a composition sole, made from reclaimed rubber that outlasted leather in wet conditions, a steel shank for arch support, and quadruple stitching at every stress point. It was not elegant. It was not impressive to look at. It was ugly, functional, and it worked. The roughout shoe was initially paired with the M1938 canvas legging, but the legging created its own problems in the field. It was slow to lace. It trapped mud and water around the ankle. And it was one more separate item the supply system had to manufacture, ship, track, and replace. So the Corps developed the next step. The M1943 combat service boot, which soldiers called the double buckle boot, integrated the shoe and the legging into a single unit. A leather cuff, extending above the ankle and closed by two metal buckles, eliminated the separate legging entirely. Mass production came late in the war. The boot was issued in quantity to troops overseas only by late 1944 and into early 1945, making it the quintessential footwear of the Battle of the Bulge and the final drive into Germany. This was the boot that the German soldier at the Belgian crossroads was pulling off an American body because it was better than anything his own supply system could still deliver. But the thing that truly mattered, the thing that the German soldier kneeling in the snow could never have seen because it was not visible on the boot itself, was not the boot. It was the system behind the boot. Every like on this video helps the algorithm bring this kind of deep history to the viewers who actually want it. If you are one of those viewers, hit the like button now. It takes 2 seconds, and it changes what YouTube shows to the next person searching for the real story behind the Second World War. The United States Army quartermaster system operated on a principle that no German planner in 1944 could have replicated, because the principle required something Germany no longer possessed. It required surplus. It required an economy so productive that it could afford to build redundancy into every level of the supply chain, from the factory floor to the foxhole. Every American soldier received an initial issue of 2 pairs of boots. Each pair was designed to be resolved twice before being replaced with a new or rebuilt pair. When a pair wore out beyond field repair, the soldier walked into a supply point and drew a replacement pair. Behind every supply point sat a repair infrastructure that by the end of the war numbered more than 400 shops across all theatres of operation, from large fixed installations in rear areas to mobile cobbler units that followed combat divisions within miles of the front lines. The system that Robert Patterson, the Under-Secretary of War, described in a statement issued on June 4, 1945, through the Quartermaster Review, maintained 30 different types of footwear, in sizes ranging from 3 to 15.5, in widths from quadruple A to sextuple E, with stock schedules calibrated so carefully that a supply point would not run out of common size 9D while sitting on crates of odd size 7 AAA that nobody needed. The system was not glamorous. Nobody wrote songs about it, but it was the difference between an army that could fight through the winter and an army that could not. The human scale of the repair operation is worth pausing on, because the numbers sound like they belong to a factory, not to a war. In Rome, after the city's liberation in June of 1944, 2 American corporals set up a boot repair operation using 10 Italian cobblers they hired locally. That single, small unit, 2 soldiers and 10 civilians working in a requisitioned shop in a liberated city, repaired more than 4,000 pairs of boots every single month. In the Pacific, a quartermaster mobile repair company stationed on the Mariana Islands was returning 10,000 pairs a month to service. Across every theatre, every army group, every corps area, these repair units ran continuously, pulling boots back from the edge of uselessness and putting them back on soldiers' feet. And behind the repair shops stood the factories. The single most important name in the story of American military footwear is a name that almost nobody outside of upstate New York has ever heard. Endicott Johnson Corporation, headquartered in the triple cities of Binghamton, Johnson City, and Endicott, New York. At its wartime peak, Endicott Johnson employed roughly 24,000 workers in its factories along the Susquehanna River Valley. Boosted by military contracts, the company's total output reached 52 million pairs of shoes per year, civilian and military combined. By one estimate, Endicott Johnson alone manufactured approximately 25 million pairs of roughout combat boots during the Second World War. 25 million pairs, from a single company, in a single country that had dozens of other shoe manufacturers running at full wartime capacity alongside it. Companies like International Shoe, Brown Shoe, and General Shoe Corporation were all producing military footwear at the same time. The aggregate output was staggering. A reclaimed rubber sole substitute that the Quartermaster Corps developed was saving 30 million pounds of sole leather per year, freeing that leather for uppers and linings. The American soldier's boot was not a product. It was an output of the largest footwear manufacturing base in the history of the world, operating at full wartime mobilization. This was not an accident of wartime improvisation. It was the product of a country that had been making shoes at industrial scale for nearly a century before the war began. The American civilian shoe industry in the 1930s and 40s was the largest in the world. New England mill towns like Brockton and Lynn in Massachusetts, Lewiston in Maine, and the triple cities of upstate New York had been producing footwear in factory quantities since the 1860s. The skills, the machinery, the supply chains, the trained labor forces, all of it existed before the first mobilization order was signed. When the War Department needed millions of combat boots, it did not have to build an industry from nothing. It redirected an industry that was already running. American civilians, meanwhile, were placed under shoe rationing beginning in February of 1943. Each civilian was allowed 3 pairs of leather shoes per year through the ration coupon system. Rubber work boots and overshoes had been rationed since the autumn of 1942, but this was rationing born of abundance, not scarcity. The system restricted civilian consumption to ensure military supply, not because the nation lacked capacity. The nation's shoe production was so enormous that even after diverting the majority to military use, the civilian population still had enough footwear to function. In Germany, the situation was the opposite. Civilian shoe rationing had been in effect since the start of the war, and by 1943, German civilians were struggling to find leather shoes at all. By 1944, families in bombed-out cities were repairing their own shoes with whatever scraps of leather or rubber they could scavenge, or going without. The contrast between a nation that rationed from surplus and a nation that rationed from destitution tells the entire story of the two war economies in miniature. The difference between the two countries was not ingenuity. German engineers and craftsmen were every bit as skilled as their American counterparts. German leather was, in peacetime, among the finest in Europe. The difference was access to raw materials and the industrial capacity to process them at wartime scale. Two things that Germany's strategic position, blockaded by sea and fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously, made impossible to sustain. The economic historian Adam Tooze, in his landmark study, The Wages of Destruction, documented in exhaustive detail how the Nazi war economy was built on a foundation of resource scarcity that no amount of administrative reorganization or synthetic chemistry could overcome. Germany was trying to fight a global war with the raw materials of a medium-sized European country, and every year the gap between what the war consumed and what the economy could produce grew wider. Behind the factories stood the raw material chain. Domestic cattle ranches across the Great Plains and the Southwest supplied hides. Tanneries in New England and the upper Midwest processed them into leather. Rubber plantations under Allied control, supplemented by the vast American synthetic rubber program, supplied sole material. Brass mills made eyelets and buckle hardware. A transportation network of railroads and merchant shipping moved raw materials from source to factory and finished boots from factory to port, to theatre, to depot, to the soldiers' feet. And defending the entire chain was a navy that kept the sea lanes open so that every component arrived at the factory floor on schedule. Now consider what was happening on the German side during those same years. The marschstiefel, that magnificent jackboot, required an enormous quantity of leather for every single pair. A tall shaft, a thick sole, a full leather lining, heavy stitching throughout. In 1939, that was manageable. Germany had pre-war stockpiles of leather. Germany had occupied territories that could be requisitioned for hides. Germany had leather, but the supply was not infinite, and the war was consuming it faster than it could be replaced. The British naval blockade, which had been strangling German imports since the first day of the war, cut off access to the foreign hides and tanning chemicals that German industry had depended on in peacetime. Domestic cattle herds were being slaughtered for food as the war economy tightened, reducing the supply of hides at the source. And the army was growing. Every new division mobilized needed thousands of pairs of boots, and every month of active campaigning destroyed thousands more through normal wear. The German response was to shrink the boot. In 1939, the jackboot shaft was shortened from its original height, reducing the leather requirement per pair. By 1940, rear echelon personnel, supply troops, clerks, and headquarters staff were no longer issued jackboots at all. They received instead the Schnürschuhe, a low-cut lace-up ankle boot worn with short canvas gaiters, a cheaper and faster item to manufacture that used significantly less leather. By 1941, new recruits across the entire army stopped receiving jackboots entirely, regardless of their branch of service. The ankle boot with gaiters became the universal issue for every soldier entering the Wehrmacht. By late 1943, jackboot production ceased altogether. The United States War Department's own intelligence assessment of this decline is preserved in Technical Manual E. 3451, the Handbook on German Military Forces, dated March 15, 1945. It states in plain language that the traditional marching jackboot had received much adverse criticism in the German military press, that by 1941 its use was limited to infantry, engineers, and motorcyclists, and that issue had finally been completely suspended, although existing stocks would continue to be used up. The lace-up Schnürsche, the manual noted, now replaces the boot entirely. Read that timeline one more time. The most iconic piece of military equipment in the German arsenal, the symbol of the Wehrmacht's power, the boot that had marched through Warsaw and Paris and to the gates of Moscow, was discontinued 3 years before the war ended because the nation that built it could no longer afford the leather to make it. What replaced the jackboot was not just smaller, it was increasingly made from inferior materials. As the blockade tightened and Allied bombing degraded German industrial capacity, the Wehrmacht turned to substitutes. Buna synthetic rubber, developed by IG Farben under the 4-year plan to free Germany from dependence on imported natural rubber, went into shoe soles. The tannery firm Freudenberg began mass-producing synthetic rubber soles as early as 1938, in response to what it described as a leather shortage that had existed from 1934 onward. Wood-soled boots appeared in the supply chain, heavy and inflexible, tolerable for standing sentry duty in a fixed position, but agonizing on a forced march. By the final year of the war, the quality of replacement footwear had deteriorated so far that German soldiers reported new boots wearing through within weeks of issue. The soles cracked. The synthetic materials split in the cold. A boot that disintegrates before the campaign it was issued for is over is not a boot. It is evidence that the system has failed. By the winter of 1943 to 1944, the average wool content of German uniform cloth had fallen to roughly 50%, with some uniforms dropping as low as 40%. The wool itself was of such low quality from reworking that the resulting uniforms had a visibly degraded appearance. The boots followed the same downward curve as the uniforms. The material was failing because the material simply was not there. The Eastern Front was where the boot failure killed on the largest scale. When the Wehrmacht invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, the German High Command planned for a short campaign: victory before winter, summer uniforms, standard leather boots. No cold weather preparation beyond minimal quantities. The war, they believed, would be over by October. It was not. The Soviet Union refused to collapse on schedule. By December of 1941, German troops were fighting outside Moscow in temperatures that plunged to -40 degrees, wearing the same leather marschstiefel they had been issued for the summer advance 5 months earlier. Nobody in the German supply chain had prepared winter footwear in sufficient quantities because nobody in the German High Command had believed winter footwear would be needed. The boots froze solid overnight. Soldiers who removed their boots to warm their feet by a fire found that they could not get the boots back on because the leather had contracted into a rigid shell. Men who kept their boots on found that moisture from foot sweat had nowhere to go and formed a layer of ice between the sock and the leather. Feet that had been damp with sweat during the long autumn marches were now encased in rigid, ice-cold casings that conducted cold directly through the sole and into the flesh. The frostbite epidemic that followed was one of the great medical disasters of the Second World War. During the Battle of Moscow alone, approximately 130,000 cases of frostbite were reported among German troops, with roughly 15,000 resulting in amputations. Estimates for the full winter of 1941 to 1942 run as high as 250,000 frostbite cases across the entire Eastern Front. Feet were involved in the vast majority. Men who had survived the combat, who had fought through the encirclements and the counterattacks and the brutal retreats of that first winter, lost toes, lost feet, lost entire legs, because their boots were not designed for the conditions and their supply system had no capacity to replace them with anything better. The desperation drove men to acts that German veterans described in their post-war writings with a flatness that is more disturbing than any dramatization. Willy Peter Reese, a German soldier who served on the Eastern Front and whose experiences were published posthumously in the memoir titled A Stranger to Myself, described taking an axe to a frozen Soviet corpse in order to remove its felt boots. The Soviet Valenki, a simple boot made from compressed wool felt, was crude by any Western standard. It had no structured sole. It had no ankle support system. It looked like something a medieval peasant would wear, and it kept feet alive in temperatures that German engineering leather could not survive. German soldiers traded for Valenki. They fought over them. They pulled them off the frozen dead with tools because the corpses were too rigid to undress by hand. Joseph Goebbels, the Reich propaganda minister, launched a nationwide clothing and winter equipment collection drive in December of 1941. The drive gathered more than 76 million items from German civilians, including coats, fur collars, scarves, gloves, sweaters, blankets, and boots. Set aside the propaganda purpose of the campaign. Consider what it meant as a strategic confession. The German state, the state that had spent an entire decade telling its citizens it was building the most powerful military force on earth, was now asking housewives and schoolteachers and shop clerks to donate their winter coats and their spare boots because the government could not clothe or shoe the army it had sent into Russia. 76 million items from civilians. That is not a donation drive. That is an admission of systemic failure. If your father or grandfather or great-uncle served in the Second World War, in any branch, in any theatre, on any side of the conflict, I would be honored to hear their story in the comments below. What unit were they in? Where did they serve? What did they remember about the small, unglamorous details? The boots, the food, the cold, the mud. Those details are the ones that the official histories leave out. They are also the details that actually tell us what the war felt like for the men who fought it, and they deserve to be preserved by the families who carry them. Now, someone watching this might argue that the German boot failure was simply a run of bad luck. They ran out of leather. They encountered a Russian winter they were not prepared for. These were mistakes, perhaps even understandable ones, not proof of a systemic failure. But that argument collapses when you examine what happened on the American side in the winter of 1944 to 1945, because the Americans came dangerously close to suffering the same catastrophe. And the way they responded to it is the final proof that the difference between the two armies was never the boot itself. It was the machine behind the boot. The Hurtgen Forest, September to December, 1944. 50 square miles of dark ancient woodland along the German-Belgian border, just south of Aachen. The trees grew so close together that armoured vehicles could barely pass between the trunks. The canopy was so dense that even at midday, the forest floor was in permanent twilight. Artillery shells that hit the treetops exploded into showers of wooden splinters and steel fragments that rained straight down into foxholes, making every bombardment exponentially more lethal than it would have been in open ground. The mud was knee-deep in the firebreaks, water pooled in every depression, and the temperature, as autumn turned to winter, dropped below freezing and stayed there. American divisions were fed into those woods one after another and ground apart in close range, often hand-to-hand fighting, where the front line could shift by 100 meters in an hour and shift back before nightfall. Of roughly 120,000 American troops committed to the Hurtgen, approximately 24,000 were killed, wounded, or captured in direct combat. But another 9,000 fell to what the army classified as non-battle casualties, a category that included combat exhaustion, pneumonia, and trench foot. The 4th Infantry Division alone lost approximately 4,000 battle casualties and more than 2,000 additional men to trench foot and exposure during its time in the hurtgen. A rifle company in those woods could lose 100 to 200% of its original strength in a single week of fighting. The Battle of the Bulge that exploded across the Ardennes in December was even worse for cold injuries, and it was during the Bulge that the boot gap between the two armies became most starkly, most painfully visible. The photograph from the Belgian crossroads is only the most famous image from a pattern that was widespread during the German offensive. German soldiers stripped boots, overshoes, gloves, and field jackets from American dead and prisoners throughout the opening phase of the attack. The practice became so common that it intersected with another crisis entirely. Otto Skorzény's Operation Greif had infiltrated English-speaking German soldiers behind American lines, wearing captured American uniforms and equipment. The resulting security panic meant that any soldier found wearing mismatched gear, American boots on German legs or German boots on American feet, was treated with extreme suspicion. According to veteran accounts, at least one American officer was detained simply because he was wearing German boots he had picked up on the battlefield. German prisoners caught wearing American uniforms or equipment faced the possibility of being treated as spies rather than lawful combatants. The desperation cut both ways in that single brutal winter. American veterans of units surrounded in the Bulge later described scavenging boots and clothing from their own fallen comrades to survive the cold. But the strategic asymmetry remained absolute. American losses could be and were replaced. German losses compounded into permanent, irreversible decline. Across the entire European theatre, in the winter of 1944 to 1945, American cold injury casualties totaled somewhere between 46,000 and 71,000 men, depending on the counting method used. Of the roughly 91,000 frostbite cases American land forces suffered in Europe across the whole war, approximately 46,000 occurred in that one winter along the German border. Feet were involved in 85 to 90% of all cases. Roughly 90% of the men affected were frontline riflemen, each one a trained infantryman. The army could not afford to lose. By January of 1945, the trench foot and frostbite losses in the 12th Army Group alone equaled the fighting strength of approximately 3 full infantry divisions removed from the line. The causes were documented and damning. Overshoe shortages left some units with galoshes for only 1 man in 4. The M1944 shoepack, a rubber-bottom, leather-top cold-weather boot with a removable felt liner that was the genuine solution to the wet, cold conditions of the Ardennes, arrived late and in insufficient numbers. When it did arrive, it was frequently poorly fitted. The rubber lower section trapped foot sweat, and without enough spare socks and felt insoles to allow regular changes, the boot that was supposed to prevent trench foot could actually make it worse. Foot discipline in many frontline units was almost non-existent. Platoon leaders and company commanders, who should have been ordering mandatory sock changes and foot inspections every 12 hours, were simply too overwhelmed by the intensity of the fighting to enforce the protocols. In some units, men went days without removing their boots because the tactical situation did not allow it. In others, replacement socks were available at the supply point but never reached the foxholes because the carrying parties could not get through the shelling. The system had the supplies. The last mile of delivery, from supply point to fighting position, was where the system broke down under combat pressure. General George Patton, commanding the Third Army, grasped the severity of the crisis and addressed it with his characteristic bluntness. In November of 1944, Patton issued a letter to his commanders, declaring that the most serious menace confronting the army was not the German forces, which he considered practically destroyed, but the weather, which, if they did not exert themselves, would destroy them through the incidents of trench foot. His personal account of the war, published after his death, devotes considerable space specifically to the trench foot problem. Patton was not indulging in hyperbole. The data supported him. Where foot discipline and dry sock rotation were rigorously enforced under commander tension, trench foot rates dropped by as much as 75%. And here is where the two armies' stories finally and permanently diverge. The Americans stumbled. They bled. They lost the equivalent of several infantry divisions to what amounted to a failure of logistics and leadership at the small unit level. And then they fixed it. The cold injury rate in the Fifth Army in Italy dropped from roughly 54 per 1,000 men per year in the winter of 1943 to 1944 to about 20 per 1,000 in the following winter. Because the army applied the brutal lessons of the first winter to the second, shoe packs were distributed more widely. Sock rotation schedules were enforced. Company commanders were held personally accountable for their unit's trench foot numbers. Medical authorities in the European theatre concluded that the shoe pack, when properly fitted and used with adequate socks and insoles, was the most effective tool available for preventing trench foot in wet, cold conditions. The system identified the failure. The system corrected it. The system learned. The German system, by 1944, could no longer learn. It could no longer adapt. Not because German officers were less intelligent or German soldiers less hardy, but because the material base that adaptation requires, the factories, the leather, the rubber, the transport capacity, the replacement depots, had been bombed, blockaded, and consumed beyond recovery. A German divisional commander who identified a problem with his men's boots in November of 1944 had nowhere to send the complaint. The factories were producing what they could with whatever materials remained, which was less with every passing month. The supply lines were under constant Allied air attack. The horses that pulled the Wehrmacht's supply wagons were dying of exhaustion and starvation. And the scale of Germany's logistical disadvantage extended far beyond boots. The popular image of a fully mechanized Wehrmacht is one of the great myths of the Second World War. The German army entered the war in 1939 with 514,000 horses. Over the course of the entire conflict, it employed approximately 2.75 million horses and mules. The average number of horses in the army at any given time reached roughly 1.1 million. Of the 264 German combat divisions that existed in November of 1944, only 42 were armoured or motorised. The remaining 222 divisions, the vast bulk of the army, marched on foot with horse-drawn supply trains. Each standard infantry division fielded approximately 5,300 horses. The American counterpoint to those horse-drawn wagons was a motorized supply operation, so massive it required its own name and its own dedicated road network. The Red Ball Express, conceived during a 36-hour planning session and operational from August 25 to November 16, 1944, used at its peak nearly 6,000 trucks to move roughly 12,500 tons of supplies per day from the Normandy beaches to the advancing First and Third Armies. Over its 83 days of operation, the Red Ball transported approximately 412,000 tons of materiel, ammunition, fuel, rations, medical supplies, and boots. Roughly 3/4 of the Red Ball Express drivers were African-American soldiers serving in segregated quartermaster truck companies, men who drove 18 to 20 hours a day on shattered French roads, often without headlights to avoid air attack, hauling loads that included everything from tank shells to toilet paper to boots. They were serving an army that segregated them, in a country that denied many of them the vote, and they were keeping that army alive. Their contribution to the Allied victory in Europe was absolutely indispensable, and the recognition they received for decades afterward fell criminally short of what they deserved. The Red Ball was only the most famous of several dedicated express routes that supplied the Allied advance across France. The White Ball, the Green Diamond, the Lion Express, and the ABC routes followed as the front pushed eastward. Together, these operations formed a supply artery that kept the largest expeditionary force in the history of warfare fed, armed, fueled, and shod while it fought its way across a continent. The contrast between these two supply systems was not a matter of degree, it was a difference in kind. The American system could deliver a specific boot, in a specific size, in a specific width, to a specific soldier at a specific supply point within days or weeks of a requisition being filed. The German system, by late 1944, often could not deliver boots at all. A German infantry regiment that lost 200 pairs of boots in a week of fighting might receive 50 replacement pairs, in sizes that might or might not match the feet that needed them, delivered by a horse-drawn wagon that might or might not arrive before the regiment was ordered to move again. German prisoners captured in the weeks after D-Day offered perhaps the most telling reaction to this machinery. According to a story that became common among American intelligence officers, groups of German soldiers waiting for transfer to prisoner-of-war camps watched American trucks, tanks, half-tracks, jeeps, and equipment rolling ashore from landing craft in what seemed like an endless, unbroken stream, and asked their captors where the horses were. Whether or not those exact words were spoken, the story captured something real. Their own army still ran on animal transport. The concept that an entire military force could operate without a single draft horse was outside the boundaries of their experience. At Trent Park, the converted country manor house north of London where British intelligence held captured senior German officers in comfortable conditions while secretly recording every word they said to each other, the transcripts reveal the same bewilderment expressed at a far higher level. The German generals knew they were being outproduced. They said so to each other in conversations they believed were completely private. Thousands of pages of Trent Park transcripts, later published and analyzed by the German historian Sonke Neitzel, contain repeated, candid discussions of American material abundance, delivered in tones that range from reluctant professional admiration to something much closer to despair. They discussed tanks and aircraft and artillery shortages, but they also kept returning to the small things, the things an ordinary soldier on the front line notices long before he notices grand strategy. The quality of the American rations, which included items like chocolate and canned meat that German soldiers had not seen in their own supply system for years. The warmth of the American winter uniforms, which used wool that was still wool and not half rayon, and above all, the boots, the apparently inexhaustible supply of boots. The fact that an American private, the lowest-ranking man in the formation, wore better footwear than a German lieutenant who had been fighting since Poland. This was a source of genuine psychological distress, not just material disadvantage. German soldiers who had entered the war in 1939, wearing the finest military boots their nation could produce, were now, 5 years later, marching in ankle boots with synthetic soles that cracked in cold weather and wore smooth on paved roads. Every step was a reminder that the system behind them was failing. Every encounter with an American prisoner or an American corpse wearing solid leather boots with composition soles that still had tread was a reminder that the enemy's system was not. The truth those German generals were circling in their bugged conversations, the truth they could describe but never quite fully articulate, was that the war had been decided not in the spectacular engagements that fill the history books, but in the quiet, unglamorous, invisible contest between two industrial systems operating at fundamentally different scales. One system could put a fresh pair of boots on a soldier's feet after a week of fighting in the mud. The other could not. And over the course of 5 grinding years of war, across millions of miles of marching on every kind of terrain, from Russian steppe to Norman hedgerow to Belgian forest, that difference compounded relentlessly. It compounded in trench foot cases that removed men from the line. It compounded in frostbite amputations that removed men from the war permanently. It compounded in the morale of soldiers who looked down at their own disintegrating footwear and understood, without anyone telling them, that their country was losing the war from the ground up. The war correspondent, Ernie Pyle, who was carried by more than 300 American newspapers and won the Pulitzer Prize in 1944 for his dispatches from the front lines, wrote with relentless, unsentimental honesty about the infantryman's daily reality. He did not write about grand strategy or the decisions of generals. He wrote about the men he called the goddamned infantry, the men who lived in the mud, who slept in holes scratched out of frozen earth, whose feet were never dry for weeks at a time, and who kept marching forward anyway. Pyle was killed by Japanese machine gun fire on the island of Ishima in April of 1945. He never saw the end of the war he had chronicled better than anyone. Sergeant Bill Mauldin, whose cartoon dog faces Willy and Joe appeared in the military newspaper Stars and Stripes and earned him a Pulitzer Prize in 1945 at the age of just 23, drew the war from the ground level. Literally from the ground level. His cartoons showed mud-caked boots, waterlogged foxholes, exhausted men in rain-soaked uniforms with thousand-yard stares. The recurring theme was the misery of the infantry's feet, their blisters, their soaked socks, and their crumbling boots. Mauldin insisted on drawing every piece of equipment accurately because, as he wrote, frontline soldiers deeply resented seeing their gear pictured wrong. The boots in his cartoons are the roughout boots and the double buckle boots, drawn with the care and precision of a man who had worn them himself in the mountains of Italy, where he was wounded by a mortar fragment. Pyle and Mauldin understood something that the strategic thinkers and the generals and the historians who came after them have often missed. The war was not fought by divisions or armies or army groups. It was fought by individual men standing in individual foxholes, and those men fought from the feet up. A soldier whose feet are dry and reasonably warm can march to the next objective. A soldier whose feet are rotting inside his boots cannot take another step. A soldier who knows that a new pair of boots is waiting for him at the supply point behind the line fights with a different kind of confidence than a soldier who knows that when these boots finally fall apart, nothing will replace them. The first soldier is fighting inside a system that sustains him. The second soldier is fighting on borrowed time, and he knows it. There is no propaganda poster in the world that can overcome the message a man receives from his own feet every time he takes a step in a boot that is falling apart. That message says, plainly and without ambiguity, that his country has failed him at the most basic level. It could not give him something to walk in. So here is the answer to the question that the German soldier at the Belgian crossroads could not have asked that morning, because he was too cold, too hungry, and too occupied with the immediate task of surviving to think in those terms. Why were the American boots better? They were not always better. The American Type 1 and Type 2 service shoes were demonstrably worse than the marschstiefel. The early shoe pack was poorly distributed, and in some cases made cold injuries worse rather than preventing them. The American Army suffered approximately 91,000 frostbite cases in the European theatre alone. Nobody on the American side fought this war with perfect equipment. Nobody fought it without suffering. The Americans were better not because they had a perfect boot, but because when the boot failed, they had a system that could identify the failure, engineer a replacement, test it in the field, manufacture it by the millions, ship it across an ocean, truck it to a supply point behind the front, and put it on a soldier's feet before the next battle began. And when that system failed too, as it did catastrophically in the Hurtgen forest and the Ardennes, it had the industrial depth and the institutional willingness to diagnose the failure, accept the blame, and correct the problem for the next winter. The German army had a magnificent boot and no system left to sustain it. The American army had an adequate boot and a system that was, by any honest historical measure, the most productive military logistics apparatus ever deployed up to that point in the history of warfare. There is a lesson in this that extends far beyond the Second World War, and it is a lesson that military planners and historians have been grappling with ever since. The Wehrmacht's Marschstiefel was, considered purely as a piece of equipment, a superior boot to the American roughout shoe, better leather, taller shaft, more protection. A German cobbler looking at both boots side by side in 1939 would have judged the jackboot, the finer article of workmanship, without hesitation, and he would have been correct. But wars are not decided by the quality of a single item. They are decided by the ability to produce, distribute, maintain and replace that item across years of sustained combat involving millions of men over thousands of miles of contested territory. The jackboot was built for a short war. The roughout boot was built for a long one. The war was long. Over 4 million pairs of boots that were too worn for continued military use were not destroyed. They were redistributed to liberated civilians across France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Additional quantities were channeled through the American Red Cross to Allied prisoners of war freed from German camps. 4 million pairs of American cast-offs put onto the feet of people the army had come to free. The German army could not shoe its own soldiers by 1944. The American army was shoeing liberated Europe with its surplus. That single fact tells the story of the war more clearly than any battle map ever drawn. The names in this story are not the names that usually fill the chapters of Second World War histories. Georges Doriot, the French-born Harvard professor who revolutionized the way the American military equipped its soldiers. Edmund Gregory, the quartermaster general who had the foresight to recruit a business school professor to solve a logistics crisis. The 24,000 men and women of Endicott Johnson, who cut and stitched and lasted and nailed millions of pairs of combat boots in their factories along the Susquehanna River, while their own sons and brothers wore those boots in the mud of France and the snow of Belgium. The African-American truck drivers of the Red Ball Express who kept 12,500 tons of supplies moving every single day across a battered French road network. The 2 corporals in Rome who requisitioned a shop, hired 10 Italian cobblers, and repaired 4,000 pairs of boots a month with whatever materials they could scrounge. Ernie Pyle, who made the infantry's suffering visible to an entire nation of newspaper readers. Bill Mauldin, who drew their boots accurately because accuracy was the only form of respect he could offer from the pages of a newspaper. And the German soldier at the crossroads in Belgium. His name is not recorded. He is known only by a photograph. A man kneeling beside a man in the snow, working a boot free. He was not a villain. He was a soldier at the broken end of a supply line that no longer reached him, wearing boots that no longer held together, fighting for an army that had built the most feared military machine in history and could not, in the end, make that machine a decent pair of shoes. Wars are decided by weapons, they are sustained by logistics, and logistics, stripped down to its most basic human element, is nothing more than the distance between a factory floor and a soldier's feet. One army closed that distance. The other watched it grow until there was nothing left to bridge it. If this investigation gave you something to think about, subscribe to the channel. There are more stories like this one waiting to be told. Stories about the overlooked details that actually decided the war. Not the tanks, not the generals, not the sweeping arrows on the situation maps. The boots, the rations, the supply trucks, the cobblers, and the factory workers who built the unglamorous infrastructure of victory 1 pair at a time. They deserve to be remembered, because without them, none of the rest of it would have been possible.